the firm is called Stoss. Stoss means push or kick in German, like kick in the pants, kick in the ass. It's also a geological term in American geology that refers to the impact side of a glacial landform. But after I got the business cards printed, I learned that it's also a dirty word in German. It refers to something you might be doing on a Friday night or Saturday night as you go out for a beer or post-beer or something. But the business cards were printed and we had to stick with it. As David said, we're interested in pushing a much broader landscape agenda, interested in moving beyond more visual and decorative approaches to landscape to those issues that can address more far-reaching topics like infrastructure, urbanism, ecology, sustainability, flexible programming, interim use. For us, landscapes must be conceived and positioned relative to large-scale geographical, environmental, and infrastructural systems, regardless of whether the landscape in question is small or large. Landscapes must tap into the evolving dynamics of ecological and civic or social systems in order to remain healthy and resilient. And landscapes must set up conditions for a wide range of uses and appropriations for both those we can imagine now and for those we cannot, in order to be viable immediately and for years to come. Now, to achieve these ends, we favor a performance-based approach over one that is primarily physical, spatial, or visual. We're especially interested in how landscapes work, how they function urbanistically, socially, hydrologically, environmentally, how they reinforce existing city frameworks and how they invent new ones, and how they may support a range of complementary and sometimes contradictory civic programs across a multifaceted, layered and thickened urban field. Within this realm, we draw on a number of sources, including some of the writings of the architect and urbanist Stan Allen, who talks about ecology or engineering as being concerned, quote, with the behavior of large-scale assemblages over time. They don't work primarily with images or meaning, he writes, or even with objects, but with performance, energy inputs and outputs, the calibration of force and resistance. They're less concerned with what things look like and more concerned with what they can do. Within this vein, public space, for us, must set up conditions for action and exchange, for encounter and experimentation. Projects must be conceived as flexible and resilient, able to absorb new uses and activities, new inputs and economies, while continuing to adapt to and thrive within sometimes radically altered circumstances. In this way, public space is made meaningful through the actions and activities it fosters and sustains, not in the formal or intellectual relationships it establishes. Public spaces must perform biologically, physically, socially, ecologically, technically, and administratively. Now, the practice in the last few years has evolved a bit and really becomes the focus tonight for how I want to present some of the work. Recent work has expanded to include complex landscapes on structure, experimental gardens, institutional buildings, projects with architects, and more modest, small-scale projects for public clients. And here we're developing a focused interest in thickened, high-performance surfaces that are capable of performing multiple tasks simultaneously: water collection, diversion, recirculation, heat capture, absorption, careful release strategies, some of the same issues that these guys were just talking about, particularly in their last project. As well as the externalization of infrastructural and mechanical systems. In this way, by tapping into these multiple issues, proposed landscape surfaces are rendered as multidimensional, high-performance living skins that can respond and adapt to social, administrative, and environmental inputs through time. This is kind of high-performance surfaces writ large, taken to an extreme, if you will. It's also a test of high-density landscape urbanist strategies. If anybody's been following some of what's been coming out in the field lately with landscape urbanism, typically a lot of the urban strategies look at cities that are decentralizing or becoming less dense. And what we were interested in doing and had the opportunity to do here in Toronto is really test some of these principles at a very large scale, but in a place that required density. We're in Toronto. We're working on 300 acres of Portland here at the mouth of the Don River, right near downtown. You can see it's a complex site. It's choked off by all this infrastructure. There are rail lines, highways, roadways, and then the poor river's kind of been put in this channel and forced to make a 90-degree turn. I don't know how many 90-degree turns you've seen rivers take in the natural environment, but it causes a lot of problems in terms of sedimentation and flooding. This was also a big industrial area, and so a lot of the land here is contaminated environmentally. We kind of looked at the river. This is the river valley, and the river originally opened up onto this fantastically huge marshland, and so it lazily emptied into this bay and then into the lake. And through time, that was changed quite significantly. The river was channeled, it was kind of choked off by this infrastructure. And in order to then give life back to the river, which was point one of the brief we were given, we needed to create an appropriately sized and scaled footprint for the river, and one that could perform the way that the river needed to perform. It was also important in kind of restoring this river, if you will, that you had to realize that we weren't looking at a pure natural restoration. In fact, the history of this place talks about human interaction in the river, and it was very much this constructed river environment that we were interested in. And here, we imagine actively inhabiting this dynamic mouth of the Don at a renewed and reestablished ecological interface between the river and the lake, and at an expanded cultural interface between Toronto and its lakefront. Now, the way to win competitions is put little kids in photos. We didn't win, but we put little kids in the photos, and it really gets people. They love it. I worked for Michael Van Valkenburg for a year, and I learned this from him. He puts kids with a red balloon. Next time you see, well, look for the kid with the red balloon. Brilliant. But again, here we were interested in allowing the river to shape the city. Usually the city shapes the river. And we were interested in letting the river come first, giving rise to unique, dynamic, engaging, world-class neighborhoods and open spaces to create a new kind of metropolitan district. Now, this project is huge, and I'm only really going to focus on one piece of it, which is how do you make a river, right? It's a critical issue because we needed to understand the dynamics, ecologies, and physical requirements of the river first as a living, functioning entity, and then use this understanding as a foundation for building vital and viable urban fabrics. And so we did a lot of research. We worked with teams of ecologists and engineers and came up with a series of principles that would guide what we were doing. First of which was to amplify the interface. The river-lake interface is the richest breeding ground for wildlife, particularly for fish. Fish that live in the lake, fish that live in the river, all come to the kind of in-between zone to mate. And so we decided we needed to create this really big sex park for fish. What better thing is there? We also wanted to look at the marsh itself from the mouth of the river to the edge of the lake. We wanted to create a very broad, very flat estuarine plate that sloped ever so slightly toward the harbor in order to maximize the effects of both river and lake fluctuation and ecological resilience. But again, we're making a river here. The Don remains a highly engineered river within a very constructed environment. And so we looked to hybridized engineering techniques deployed across the site in order to form a primary channel, broad marshes, floodway, armored uplands, in order to set up a framework that both structures and emancipates. This is essentially the project. This is the kind of diverse surface deployed across 300 acres that really gives rise to the project. Reignite dynamic ecologies. One of the interesting things is the marsh type that this is called the Lake Ontario Marsh Lagoon or something. What's interesting here is by doing this across a plain and by creating these slightly varied conditions, we really played into what the vegetation naturally does. It's interesting, vegetation, over the course of 5 years or so, the vegetation will move half mile inland, half mile out, in response to the water levels. And so this marsh can be quite dynamic and unique over the course of a number of years. By doing this, we reestablish the wilds in the middle of the city. The river takes over, spawning its own successional ecologies in response to short and long-term inputs. And in order that would continue through time, we developed these things called the habitat ramps right on the edge of the city. These were big slopes from the city down to the river, and the idea was that these would allow both access from the city to the marsh, but also function as ecological reserves that could be activated in response to river flooding and long-term lake fluctuations. In other words, somewhere along this gradient at all times would exist all the various parts of the ecological system, as well as cute kids, that would allow this ecology to sustain itself. In the process, even flood control became an opportunity. River and lake fluctuations would put in play a constantly evolving wash of low waters that are amplified by the marsh's shallow grade. The effect around and among the spits, though, is quite dramatic. Dry one month, entirely inundated the next. The spits can become temporary peninsulas that further emphasize the site's fluid occupations. And yet there are many other components to the project, and I'll flip through them quickly. Once you figure out the river side, we also had to figure out the lake, where there was a fairly homogeneous wall. And the idea was, instead of, again, having this homogeneous condition, we were interested in operating strategically on the wall to cut it down to allow access through, to create a whole series of different physical, social, and environmental conditions on top of it, behind it, and around it, to really vary the shoreline. Out of this arose two new open space types, the lake marsh and the channel basin. Lake marshes, which would function to clean water, provide habitat, provide recreational opportunities, and could be populated by these bird-friendly wind turbines that would generate energy for the neighborhood behind us. And also these intensely social urban channel basins right in the middle of the most densely developed part of the city, that could function as swimming pools in the summer, skating rinks in the winter, a series of other open spaces that literally worked. This is a park built on top of construction debris, next to a water desalination plant, next to working rail yards. The whole idea of work and landscape situated in juxtaposition with each other was important. And also the idea that we could create in the middle of the new river an island that would protect some of the historic concrete silos and create this open plain, this empty green space in the middle of this river that could either be quite isolating or quite packed with people. The buildings, we worked with Brown and Story architects to develop a set of building typologies organized around landscape courtyards. Buildings could be developed as habitat, as high-performance green machines, and in their distribution across the site really allowed for the flow of landscape in and among and between the buildings, and even up their faces. The project also included things like the design of bridges, integrated multimodal transportation networks, essentially all the things that you need to build a city for 20,000 people. So first the river, plus flood control, plus an expanded lakefront, plus open spaces that work, plus robust neighborhoods, destinations and routes, yields river city life. This is the new green city, diverse, robust, a new metropolitan district structured by the river and engaged in the rich dynamics of the lake. And just to wrap it up, these projects, I think, manifest a set of core interests for us, whether at the small or large scale. The focus here is on birth processes, generative strategies, performance criteria, implementation dynamics, and frameworks for succession and adaptation. Strategies are thoroughly grounded in the particularities of local conditions, yet they're inventive, thickly layered in order to tap into broader trends and larger systems. They privilege a regenerative approach to civic space and urban landscapes as complex, living, and evolving entities. Thanks.